Thank you. All right, so there are a lot of things we're going to cover, but this is your session, so interrupt, ask questions. If we don't get through the whole slide deck, that's totally fine, but I'm funnier with cartoons, and it's the Winter Olympics, so I thought this was fitting. And really the goal of this talk is to help prepare for your IRB submission. So we're only going to focus on IRB. In research compliance, we also have IBC, ICOOC, export control, and financial conflict of interest, but I was asked to really focus just on human subjects. And so really the goal is here, get you here, and not in our unprepared finish and fall off the slope. So that's really our goal. There are handouts that will accompany this, and those are kind of the tactics. So we're going to talk kind of theory, get you familiar with the concepts, write them down, think about, and if you have any questions, my office is just across the way in Faculty Center, where the Starbucks is, just down the big pretty doors right to the right there. So stop by, come see me, sit down. We'll go through your protocol, ask questions, and help you out. So that's definitely an option. But this is just sort of to get you right on the right track, maybe get you on the right slopes so you don't fall off and end up in the snow. All right. Okay. Yep. All right, she got it to work like 2 seconds ago. Okay, so what we're going to do is understand the levels of IRB review and define research and define human subjects. Because the first question is, do you even need to come and see the IRB, right? Because if you don't, then great, fantastic. Why put yourself through that regulatory burden if you don't have to do it? So we need to have a good understanding of some definitions. So we're going to go through a lot of definitions, but it's really key to understand that. So why get on the slope if you don't need to be here? And then understanding the levels of review is an important factor because it'll help decide what form you need to fill out, what you're going to experience, the timeline. So it's really kind of the getting you off to the right start. So our federal regulations, which is what our whole process is based on, we call it the common rule. We call it the common rule because 15 federal agencies have gotten together and said, yeah, that's our reg. So it's common among 15 agencies. And that really tells us how all of our processes. It guides us into if we can approve your research, not approve it, under what criteria, okay? And they give us these levels of review. And so if we draw the regulations in a triangle, we're going to start from the top and work our way down. We're going to get to about here in the hour that we have. But this is really important to understand because the further down you go in the triangle, the more extensive your review process is. So the more time it takes, the more you need to prepare and get your submission in so you can meet any deadlines. What do I mean by that? If you're not human subjects, you come and you see me. And I'm in the office and I'm there and I can approve it. Exempt, you come and see me and our chairs look it over and then they can do it. If you're limited, and I say 2018 requirement because our laws are changing for the first time since 1983. So the laws are changing, and so when we get into the 2018 requirement, they give us this new criteria. The best way to describe limited IRB review is if exempt and expedited got together and had a baby, it would be limited IRB review. It's got some characteristics of exempt, it's got some characteristics of expedited, and we could describe that in a moment. Expedited does not mean fast. I know it's deceiving. It just simply means that a member can review your application and approve it outside of a full meeting. Full committee simply means that all my members have to get together, we have to have quorum, and they're going to review your research together at a full board meeting. So you can imagine sometimes it is faster if I can grab a member and say, hey, review this, and we don't have to have a meeting date, right? But our members are busy folks. They have full-time jobs outside of being IRB, and so this doesn't necessarily mean fast. It means when I have a member available, and it can go round and round depending on how complete your application is. So you can see everything from an administrative, just someone in the office, to all my members have to get together. So that's what I mean by a more extensive review process. Does that make sense?
So your members, are they faculty that work here, or who are the members?
It's a good question. So IRBs are made up of a variety of folks. Our regulations actually specify who has to be on. So we have to have at least 5 members. We have to have a scientist. We have to have a non-scientist. we have to have an unaffiliated, someone who doesn't work or is associated with our university. Multiple people are faculty members, so they usually fall into some of the scientific categories. We have faculty who are non-scientists, so out of the business, or we have librarian staff who serve as members. So the goal is you kind of get a representation of the community, right? And so that's why you have to have a non-scientist. Also, if we're dealing with vulnerable populations, so for example, prisoners, we have to have a prisoner rep in the meeting and on our board so they can lend that expertise about what unique aspects and how would prisoners be impacted if we did the research. So we have our roster that we get together and we make sure that we have the Constitution requirements. But that's kind of the make is kind of a mix, and you try to get representation with experiences depending on what kind of research you're doing. So if you're doing nurse research, we have a nurse member, right? If you're doing a lot of psychology, we want someone with that background and understanding the research.
Okay.
If we don't have the expertise, we also have the ability to add in consultants at our disposal. So if maybe we're dealing with a children's study and we want a pediatrician to come in and talk to us about that, or someone who deals with family counseling and in particular children, we can invite consultants who can lend that expertise for that particular protocol as well. Yep. All right. So this is what I mean about the grade of review. So we just kind of review this. This can be reviewed by a non-voting member, like myself. I'm not a voting member as a director, versus reviewed by a voting member versus reviewed by a meeting at the convene. So timing, again, as you're planning, can be important. So if you know the level of review, you can say, oh my gosh, when's the next full board meeting? I think I'm going to go full board, and plan your submission accordingly to make sure that you get it in before that meeting date. Okay. But also, the more that you can do, here's how we split and decide where you are in the mix. So for projects that are not research and not involving human subjects, you can come in for a not human subject determination. What we're doing is we're saying, thank you for telling us about what your project is, and you're outside the rule. You don't have to go under IRB, right? It's good to actually get a review by the office, because if you're going to publish this, a journal may say, well, did you need IRB? You may also want an independent assessment of that who understands the regs to make sure that you're not doing research without IRB approval. Doing research without IRB approval is non-compliance and not a good thing. So you want to avoid that. So we offer this route. You come in, you check in, you sit in with me, and I give you an official letter to say you're not in our regs. And then that letter can be given to our journals. Exempt and limited. So to fit into these categories, you have to be minimal risk. Plus, the regs give us specific categories, requirements to fit in that, and we're going to go over those in a second. Same thing for expedited. You have to be minimal risk and fit in with very defined categories. And then finally, the default is the full committee. So anything greater than minimal risk, or if you don't fit in any of the defined categories that the federal agencies give us. So why is this really important, right? If we take something like a retrospective data, secondary data review study, depending on what you do, you can actually fit into 3 different levels of review. So this one is, if you aren't dealing with identifiers, you never know who John Smith is, and you're not recording any identifiers because you didn't get them in the first place, so you can't record them, you could be not human subjects and don't need IRB. So NIH has publicly available de-identified data. You could be not human subjects. Or you can use what's called an honest broker. So you and I are friends. I'm going to get the data. I'm not involved in your research project. I'm going to scrub all the identifiers and hold the key, and I swear upon my life that I will never give you the identifiers, even if you beg me and buy me coffee at Starbucks. I'm the honest broker. All she gets is de-identified data, right? She just went her right here, and now she doesn't have to go through IRB, okay? So using mechanisms and understanding what identifiers you need with your data can get you a more favorable regulatory category. Then we move on to exempt, same study, data, right? She's going to take a set of data, except she doesn't have me to be her honest broker, and so she needs to see the identifiers. So she knows age and initials or names, anything that can reasonably identify who John Smith is, but she's going to scrub them herself and not record those identifiers. So John Smith becomes subject 001, right? Sally becomes 002, so she's not recording. She can fall under exempt category 4. Then we move on to the next one. Well, she knows who John Smith is, And she's going to put, JS001, so she's going to keep some linking lists so she could go back to find out who John Smith is. So she actually has recorded identifiers, and suddenly she's now expedited. Same study, grabbing data and looking at data, but depending on what you do and where you want to fall on the spectrum, you could actually fall into 3 different IRB review categories. So you might structure your study differently depending on timelines. Oh my God, I have to graduate by May. I don't need the identifiers. Wow, this is really advantageous. I'm going to go find me a friend to be my honest broker, right? Okay. Or I really do need the identifiers to meet my study goals, so I have to be in this category. Okay. So that's something to think about. Those are strategies, right? Again, this is confusing. You're thinking, oh gosh, how do I actually apply that? Come see me. We'll talk it through. We'll see what you want. But it's good to know something simple like, do I need the identifiers or not? That's a good question to ask yourself, because you might find yourself being able to take advantage of some lesser regulatory reviews. Okay, so now we're going to focus on that top part of our triangle and look at that not human subject. So I'm going to draw the regs in a circle. I was really good at kindergarten. I like doodling. I'm going to draw it as a circle now. And what we're saying when we say not human subjects is we're saying that you don't fall inside the reg. You live out here. And there's 2 criteria. You're not involving research, or you're not involving human subjects, and we're going to break those apart and look at the definition. But essentially, the answer is you don't live inside the circle where you have to have IRB review and constant oversight. Okay, so this is our defining line. Does that make sense? All right. So here's our formula to find out if we're outside the circle. You have to be research plus, that plus becomes important, plus human subjects equals what I call IRB jurisdiction, which means I have authority over you. You have to come in and the IRB has to review, and we have to make sure that you meet all the regulatory requirements. So that plus is really important, because you could be not research and I don't have power over you. You could be not human subjects and I don't have power over you, right? It's a combination of the 2. I will say, if I had to choose between which argument I was going to make, it's easier to fall out on this one than this one, and we'll talk about that and why. So understanding that formula can be important, because you might want to make the argument that you're not involving human subjects, meaning I don't need all those identifiers and I'm not going to interact or intervene, versus research. But let's talk about research. So we're going to get into really fun definitions. Everyone loves talking about definitions, right? It's a really important piece, and sometimes often gets overlooked in the regulations because everyone skips over the definition section. But when you're deciding if something applies or not apply, go to the definition. So here's our definition of research. It's a systematic investigation, including research, development, testing, evaluation, designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Raise your hand if you know what that means. Isn't it fun when they give you definitions? You're like, what? Hang on, huh? All right. Actually, one of our key contributors to research human protection said that figuring out this definition was one of the hardest things to do in this world, in our world of research compliance. It's kind of fuzzy, right? There's some good things about being fuzzy. It means you can be flexible, because if regulations are very black and white and life moves, well, it's against the law usually quickly because life goes on. So our regs are flexible, and they actually have stood the test of time. I mentioned our rules have not changed since the 80s. That was a long time ago. Some of you might not have been born then, right? So to that extent, being flexible means that they can survive as science progresses and our laws have to keep up. So this is a very flexible definition, but we're going to kind of define it, and we define it through guidance. And OHRP, that's our regulatory body, Office of Human Research Protections, has given us some interesting guidance about quality improvement projects. Who's heard of a quality improvement project? Yeah. It's really big in hospital settings. So it's basically taking a look at, I have a process. So for example, I care about how fast my IRB is reviewing protocols. I want them to review fast and have high quality, right? That's a good goal to have. I'm going to measure that. Okay, and then I'm going to look at my data going, I wonder if I could add 2 more members, would that make a difference? I add 2 more members and go, gosh, our review times went down. That's great. That's a quality improvement project. I'm looking at my process going, how can I make it better? How can I make it better? How can I make it better? That feels kind of like research, though, wasn't that? Didn't I have a question? Didn't I collect data? Didn't I come to a conclusion? feels a little bit like research. So that defining line between quality improvement and research has been quite a big topic in our field over the last couple of years. But folks have kind of defined through practice and through guidance to say that quality improvement projects are not considered research. Okay, so this is where we're going to test how strong your coffee was this morning. Can you have any idea why we would say quality improvement projects are not research? So we have three options. Quality project does not contribute to generalizable knowledge. A quality project is not a systematic investigation, or doesn't involve testing. What do you guys think?
Doesn't involve testing.
Okay.
Involves lived experiences.
Yeah. All right. So it actually doesn't contribute to generalizable knowledge. So when I look at I use my example of my IRB review times, that only meets my IRB review, right? I mean, so an IRB in University of Hawaii, for example, do they care that I added 2 members and that I changed? And would my experience reflect their experience? No. I'm only looking kind of internally in my own house. So that knowledge of it's not generalizable to anyone else. I can't say every IRB out there add 2 members and all your review time problems will be solved. It was a very unique, I was looking inward, so it wasn't generalizable. So quality improvement projects fails typically on the generalizable area. Does that make sense? All right, where's my mouse there? Okay. So this defining line between research and not research, it's a little bit grayer. That's why I said if I had to make the choice, I'd make the argument I wasn't involving human subjects over research. But folks have liked to have a big, nice black and white line, and often you might hear, oh my God, if you publish, you have to go to the IRB. Who's heard that? Anyone heard that? Yeah. It's actually, I call it the publication myth. It was nice because it was very black and white. If published, go to the IRB. If not, don't worry about it. Easy. That's not so easy. This is actually OHRP's FAQ to say that publishing alone is an insufficient criteria to decide whether or not you need IRB. You could do research and never publish, right? Maybe you're busy, life moves on. You never actually publish, right? So they're saying planning to publish as a count of a quality improvement project also doesn't mean that it's research. So you could publish something and it not be research. So they're saying, yeah, publication, obviously if you do research without IRB approval and you publish, your chances of getting caught are increased. But publishing alone is not a sufficient criteria. So if you hear that, that's a myth. It's more to the analysis. We have to make sure you're fitting that definition. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so I mentioned the change in rules and really trying to get a better handle on that distinction of research and not, because it was kind of fuzzy and our definition wasn't as crystal clear as we'd like it. So in the revised common rule, they did not change the definition, but they did give us some very clear guidance about what is now not considered research. So over the time, in practice, we were saying these are not research, and now in the revised rule, they came out and said in the law, yeah, we agree, okay? And so here are some areas that maybe could impact you. So the first one is scholarly and journalistic activities, not research, okay? So if you're gonna go interview someone, oral history, journalism, legal research, historical scholarship, not research. So that one might apply to us as a university. Public health surveillance activities authorized by a public health authority. So if the CDC says, hey, university, we really like your help to go figure out and look at the flu going through campus. We'd like you to collect data. Help us. We're trying to solve a public health issue, and it's authorized by the CDC. That would not be research, even though you're kind of doing the stuff. You're collecting data. You're analyzing it. It kind of has some of the same characteristics of research, but they said, no, it's authorized by public health. This is not research. Criminal justice activities authorized by law or court for criminal investigation purposes, not research. And then finally, authorized operational activities in support of intelligence, homeland security, defense, and other national security missions. These two probably won't apply to us very often, but they're there and they're clearly considered not research. Sure.
So you said that research that is related to public health
Mm-hmm.
may be performed by CTS. Why is it not research? Because it is limited to population?
So it has nothing to do with the United States. So let me go back one more. It's the fact that they're doing it for public health reasons, so it's public surveillance activities, and it's authorized by public health. So the CDC is the Center for Disease Control, and so they're doing it because they have a mission for that agency to protect public health. So, I mean, data is collected about us all the time in relation to their mission of public health. So we collect data on deaths, for example. We collect data on outbreaks, for example, right? And so that data collection is done under a different intent than research. They're not trying to solve a hypothesis or a question. They're trying to gather data so they can deploy more doctors when there's an outbreak, or look at deaths and say, oh my gosh, more children are dying with swing sets, so we want to put a warning on a swing set, right? So their mission is very different, and so that's why. But it's two components. You can do public health research, right? So the component of this is it's surveillance and authorized by an agency who's operating under their mission to protect public health. That's the key, right? So CDC sponsors research all the time. That would come into IRB because they are doing research. So it depends on the intent. And that's actually the hardest part about research is it depends on the intent of the project. So if you come and talk to me, or I'm going to ask you questions like, well, what do you really want to do? You know, and I'm getting at, do you have a hypothesis? Or, you know, why are you doing this, right? Because it really is about intent to contribute to generalizable knowledge, right? So that's the tricky part about that definition. All right, that's a good question. All right, so now we move on in our equation to talk about human subjects. So again, maybe your research, okay, we passed that part, but you might not involve human subjects. This one's a little easier to cut. So here's our definition. We're going to walk through different parts of keywords. So human subjects means a living individual. If you want to do research on zombies, go for it. I don't protect zombies, okay? Interestingly, Canada actually does have coverage in their law for deceased individuals. So this is a distinction between the United States and Canada, just as an aside. So it says a living individual. Okay, so we're not going and protecting the deceased. Now, let's create a little wrinkle to that equation. What if I want to do research on people who've recently died, but I'm also getting genetics of their living relatives? Would I involve human subjects? Yeah. So while we say, you know, deceased, think about secondary subjects and what are you getting of their living relatives. If you have a living relative, then it would be IRB and you would involve human subjects. So here's another question. Select which situation would not be human subjects. So we have option 1. The study follows subjects to death and reviews a medical record to record long-term outcomes. Number 2, the study reviews records from state's online database of death records. And finally, number 3, a pathology provides de-identified specimens of terminally ill patients. 1, 2, or 3, which one does not involve human subjects?
The records, too.
2, yep. So the key there is they all have to be deceased, right? And so while you know, maybe the long-term or terminally ill patients, you might have some in that population that is deceased, it has to be everyone. Okay.
How would HIPAA regulations be involved in that?
So good question. So 2 different sets of regulations, completely separate, 2 different intents. So you could fall under the common rule, human subjects protections, and HIPAA, and you have to coincide. I will tell you sometimes they don't always talk and coincide. So that example was in medical records, so it's called Protected Health Information, PHI. So if you're involving PHI, you trigger HIPAA, okay? And what that means is you have a HIPAA authorization on top of a consent obligation, because it's 2 regs with 2 different needs. Now you can meld your HIPAA into your consent and do some fun things. You can waive HIPAA for research and maybe get a waiver, but you got to go through both regulations and comply with them separately, although they get melded together. And if you have PHI and you want to do that, I'm happy to answer more questions about that. But very good question. So we're going to move down. So we have our living subjects now, and we can do 1 or 2 things with them to involve human subjects. We can intervene or interact with them. So we're going to look at what intervention means. So it means physical procedures and manipulations of the subject's environments. Okay? So let's take a look at what that is. So the research adds aromatherapy for students during study sessions to measure its impact on the ability to focus. Is this an intervention? Give me a thumbs up if yes, thumbs down if no. Thumbs up, right, very good. Yeah, so this is a manipulation, easier for me to say, manipulation of the subject's environment. So it's not just the poking and prodding, I'm going to go and get blood or put on, in our typical medical situation, I'm collecting your blood pressure or things. It's also what you're doing to the environment around them, so you're impacting them. So that's something also to keep in mind. All right. Subject logs in from their home computer and creates an avatar to represent themselves. They're going to participate in a focus group with the researchers and other subjects in an online forum using the avatar. The researchers will not know which subject is represented by which avatar. Is this an interaction?
No.
No. Why not?
For one, they can't identify them, I would guess.
All right. So it actually is an interaction because you're still talking to them. You're still having conversations. They could still disclose something that is sensitive, right? They could have, they're still going to have the feels of going through that research. Now, the fact that you have an avatar in front, so you don't know that I'm Rebecca Ballard, is a method to protect the risk of confidentiality. It's still research. I'm still being interacted with. Right? That was the trick question. All right, so we've got number one, we obtain information through intervention or interaction with them. So the interaction is the communication, the talking, right? And that could happen in person. We're having a one-on-one interview. That could happen through a survey. I give you a link, you go out, you give me a survey, and I give data. Or it can happen in online forums. Then we have or, right? Or we obtain, use, study, analyze, generate identifiable private information. A couple of key words there. Let's look at private. Private information includes information of behavior in a context in which an individual can reasonably expect that no observation or recording is taking place, and the information that's been provided for a specific purpose by that individual can reasonably expect it will not be made public. How many times did we say reasonably? Right? Talk about this word reasonably. So in law, we have this thing called the reasonable person. Anyone here a reasonable person? Hopefully, we all strive to be, and that's exactly the point. It's sort of a legal fiction. The reasonable person is someone we put up on the pedestal, and they're awesome. Like, they got it together, they're logical, non-emotional, like they're the bomb, right? That's a reasonable person, okay? And so we're going to put that person on the pedestal, and we're like, hey, reasonable person, if we stick you in this environment, would you feel like you're not, it's private, right? This is an area where our life has changed. So if you would have told me 20 years ago that my computer was private, I'd be like, yeah, I might not have even had a computer 20 years ago. Now, when we post on Facebook, or we're out in the hallway having conversations that people can overhear, we're being videoed all the time. Our notion of what is being observed and not is something that's going to be constantly challenged with new technology. People have wonderful computers and cell phones and videos and cameras, and so this notion of privacy has changed a lot in the law and in our society, and yet that's how this reasonableness is being measured. And so it's really easy for people to kind of freak out about it, go, oh my God, you can't do that. But we have to really kind of always take that context of where our society is, where our notions of privacy are, what identifiers are out there. So we'll take a look at that as well. So the other piece of that is identifiable. Okay, so this is tricky too. It means private information or biospecimens for which the identity of the subject is or may readily be ascertained by the investigator or associated information. So when you come into me and we do a consult, I'm going to ask you lots of questions of, all right, well, what do you have on them? Like, could you find out who I am with what you have in front of you and what you have available. And of course, the world of what you have available changes. You can now go Google me and find out probably where I live, maybe what car I drive. Look me up on Facebook, right? So if you knew enough information about me, you could probably, with all the tools that you have available, generally figure out who I am, okay? And so that becomes a challenge of really trying to figure out this. So be mindful about what identifiers you have when you're proposing and spell them out. Give a data collection sheet. So there are also things that you can do as good practice. Don't collect birth dates, because maybe I'm the only person in your pool that's born on September 10th. Collect age. I might not be, I won't disclose my age, I might not be the only X person in the room, right? Maybe I am, I don't know. Yeah, younger group here. But you can see how just changing birth date to age could help protect the identity and confidentiality of that data, right? How much demographic information do you need about me, right? If we're in a small room, I might be the only female in that room depending on where your population is. I might be the only one here that has recently moved from DC. Could you identify me by that? Right? So think about that. The smaller your population gets, the more that certain traits that are just generally demographic could call out someone, and then you are dealing with identifiable information. Yes, ma'am.
So does this apply to entities that contain humans? Like, for example, if my study is about a school,
Uh-huh.
or multiple schools, but the data that I'm collecting, the demographic information, would make them identifiable. So any findings or anything that's reported through my interviews with certain individuals may yield some kind of identifiable, like they're rural in a
Yep.
South Texas county. I mean, it could be pretty easy to identify certain of my
Yeah,
participants.
then quite possibly yes. Now, if you're interacting, you mentioned interview. So if you were doing an interview, I'd catch you on this one anyway, right? So if you're doing an interview and actually talking to the individuals and getting data, you involve human subjects up here.
Okay.
So we don't get down here. This is an or. But let's change the facts a little bit. The school's going to give you a set of de-identified data, okay? And if it's only one school in a very rural area, then if you could, with what you have and tools around you, you could identify John Smith, then quite possibly you're dealing with identifiable data. How do you help with that? Explain it to the IRB. So let's say, explain your population. Yes, we are dealing with schools in the rural area, but I'm taking 5 schools and I'm scrambling them, so I really can't figure out the one that's in the rural area that I could identify John Smith versus it could have been one in Houston, right? So increasing your numbers, because you're increasing the pool, the likelihood of finding that unique person, because there's more of them that have shared traits, can be lessened. Does that make sense?
Well, what if there are multiple, so say my region, my geographic region that I'm looking at, maybe not as far as Houston, but a defined geographic region, and there are so many rural campuses that.
Then what's one rural campus to the other, right?
Be identifiable, right?
Right.
So, okay.
So again, it's about putting your best foot forward to the IRB, because these are the questions they have to ask by the regs. So they're going to ask you. So if you explain it to them and give them the, hey, look, we're going to do the best we can to make sure it's anonymous. We're going to do the best we can. We're not going to collect birth dates. We're not going to collect, key identifiers that would call out one rural section versus the other. So that's how you would describe it, such they can go, oh, okay, maybe it's not. Maybe it's, again, we talked about that word reasonableness, right? That's the stick. So it's a wide stick, right? It's not black and white. It's what's reasonable. Well, what's reasonable to me and what's reasonable to you and reasonable to you and you, we might differ. So how do you help explain that? Give the hook so the IRB can hang the hat on when they have to answer this question, and that's how you get through the process quicker, right? Yes, ma'am.
This might be a dumb question.
There's no such thing as dumb questions.
But if they have to sign the information sheet or the consent form, wouldn't that automatically be an identifier?
Yes, because you know my name,
Yeah.
right? So we're not going to get into informed consent, but I will answer that question. because I could spend like hours on informed consent. One of the ways you can waive consent documentation is if the only link to that person is my name, because I'm signing the form, and the risk to me is breach of confidentiality, which is why you see survey studies with a waiver of documentation, right? Maybe I go and grab a flyer. I'm going to go grab this flyer, and it says, oh, if you're interested in participating, go to this web link, right? You don't know that I did that. And then I go home, and I'm going to fill out your survey, but I'm just going to click yes, and I'm not going to put my name in, assuming your software system doesn't also collect my IP address so you would know where I live in my computer, then it would be a completely anonymous survey. You would have a waiver of documentation to do that so that you, it still would be research involving human subjects because you're doing a survey, but it wouldn't be identifiable, and that's how you get a waiver of consent documentation.
Okay.
To reduce the breach of confidentiality by signing the consent form. Does that make sense? All right. So I talked a lot about identifiers because this is a hot topic. Sadly, this won't be the first time or probably the last time you'll be hearing on this topic. And the reason for that is de-identification has long been a method to protect privacy and confidentiality. However, science and legal and computer science literature has really called this into question about whether de-identification is a true protective measure. And here's kind of a rough splattering of certain, this is by no means all of them, but recent articles where, you probably have heard this on the news, right? There was a de-identified research data set and someone went and broke the code and found out who John Smith was. There's been several of those where re-identification of de-identified data has occurred, some very notable like identifying governors. And so it's made news a lot. And so this is something that in the Revised Common Rule, our regulators considered and really thought a lot about because these studies on re-identification basically really contribute to the debate of the changes. So the feds did not change the definition, but this is something that they will be watching in the future to make sure that our regulations keep up with technology and hackers and all that computer science stuff. And so here's your tip and takeaway from this. Know that identifiers is something we're going to be asking a lot about because there's a renewed focus, and particularly when we go to the Revised Common Rule about that. So be very specific about how is the data being collected? What are you really seeing? What's being viewed from that source? What identifiers are going to be transferred to you? What will be extracted and stored in the research record? If there are any identifiers, explain them. Talk about how they're minimized. We talked about birth date to age. That's one way. Maybe you don't need John F. Smith, you need JS001, right? So think about that and how you can minimize. Where will the data be stored? How will it be protected? This is like the math problems that you didn't get credit unless you wrote it all down. You can't just skip and use the calculator. Get credit for what we're already doing. Password protected, encrypted computers, restricted access. If you're putting it on your personal laptop and you have a roommate, don't let your roommate use your laptop with research data on it, right? Think about kind of how you're protecting and making sure that no one else can see that data except the people who are supposed to. How long will it be stored? This is one of the areas that gets sent back the most. DHHS has a minimum of 3 years. If you're FDA regulated or you're sponsored, it may be more. Keep it for the longest period, but always say 3 years. And then how will it be destroyed when the time comes, right? You're doing a lot of these data security things, hopefully, with your own personal information as well as university, so get credit for it and write it down, okay? If you don't spell it out, we can't give you credit for it. So that's your tip. All right, so let's look at the scenario, kind of that identification. So we're going to give you 3 different scenarios and see which one do you think is reasonably identifiable. So our first study is looking at biking to work programs and healthy lifestyles. Subjects are asked to wear GPS tracking devices. Yeah. Investigators will receive GPS data showing where the subjects bike on a map, but we don't know which map is from which subject. Okay. Then we also have a de-identified copy of research records from previous studies. Identifiers have been removed, dates have been scrambled according to a de-identification methodology, and researchers can perform retrospective reviews of that using that tool. And then finally, we have a study that's developing an app where parents can take pictures of their child's rash, send that to the doctor. The doctor can get information back to the parent on what to do next. Treat it, come and see me, take it to the ER. And the instruction in the app tells the parents that pictures should not include any identifying features. So what do you guys think? You're on the IRB now. We have the chair here who can appoint you for 5 minutes. Which one do you think is reasonably identifiable? Or actually not identifiable, I should.
The first one.
You think that's not identifiable? Okay. Anyone else? Yeah. It's actually the middle one. Yeah. So the biking to work is tricky, and actually they had a really, really great lecture on this, and someone showed their own GPS map from these fancy little devices. And it just so happened, so I'll actually use myself as an example, I live 10 minutes from campus. If you saw my GPS map from 8 to 5 every day, and you knew all of us, out of all of us, I'm the one that lived that close, could you find out who my map is?
Yeah.
Actually be really identifiable. And in fact, some GPS data just got released. So if you've looked at the news recently about running tracking, and has actually released national security information, otherwise not known because of these fancy little devices. Technology is fun. And it's creating lots of challenges for IRBs.
It was military troops.
Exactly, yeah. So great example happened, I wrote this hypo before that, but there you go, a real life example. So if you're using technology, these are wonderful, amazing devices, wonderful, amazing research tools, but think about that data that's being on them. In fact, really an argument is to be made that IRBs actually need IT experts as part of their membership. We talked about membership earlier because these things are becoming more complicated and software is becoming more complicated. And look at the license agreement of your software that you're using, because oftentimes in that software license, when you say, I agree and download, it says, oh, and we get to keep your data and we get to sell it. So they're selling that research data if you're using that tool, right? That's not what your subject signed up for. Right? They don't want the call to have, change their long distance carrier, right? Or what data is being sent off to these third parties. So when you're using different software, you might be asked to give that software license if it's something that we're not familiar with, because we have an obligation to figure out what identifiers are being kept, sold, shared, and make sure that it's in the consent form at the very least. So we may not say, no, you can't use that software, but if there are some of those provisions, we may ask you to disclose it to your subject so they know when they click, yes, I agree, and download, what they're really agreeing to. And that can be complicated, very complex. I have no idea what my Facebook privacy settings, I'm sure there's lots of things happening there. I mean, it's a long contract that even lawyers don't like to read those disclosures. So if you have questions, come in, chat, we'll talk it through and help you figure it out. All right, so we kind of went over the levels of review. We defined research and looked at human subjects. That was a lot of information. Questions? Yeah? All right. I got 50, that clock is fast, so I got 50 minutes to buzz through exempt. Woo! All right, so we just covered the top of the triangle. All right, so we're going to exempt. And I start with these because oftentimes this is where student projects may live. If you get down and you find yourself lower, well, invite me to come back if you're not bored to death, or come and see me. All right, so here's where we were. We said not human subjects. We lived outside our circle. Exempt, by definition, fits inside the circle. Okay? But lawyers love rules. Gosh darn, we love exceptions to rules. It's how we get paid, right? We love the gray. It's fun. So exempt is basically that. You fit inside the circle, but if you make those categories, we're going to magically move you outside the circle and treat you like you've never been inside our circle. Pretty cool, huh? So think of exempt as you fit in the regs, but if you meet certain criteria, you're out of our circle. So that's kind of the concept. Make sense? Great. Okay. But there's all sorts of limits to see if you fit the exemption, and one of them is children. So we have this notion called vulnerable populations. These are individuals, classes, and groups that can't speak for themselves, maybe in situations where they're subject to coercion, undue influence. So the consenting process or the respect for persons could be compromised. So we call them vulnerable. Doesn't mean you can't do research on them. Just means you got extra requirements if you're going to tackle any of these populations. Children, prisoners, pregnant women, neonates, okay? Those types. So one of them is children. If you're doing research on children, you can't qualify for one of our exemptions. The exemption that we use a lot, survey, procedures, interviews. So, good tip, be really mindful about who you're recruiting. Think about it. Do you really need children? Maybe you do. Great. Then know that this exemption is not going to work for you. But if you don't, spell it out and say no, 18 and older. Maybe we need to do phase 1 on adults first, get a handle on that, get that under our belt, and then phase 2, we enroll it for children and know that we're going to have extra regulatory requirements, right? So think about those. Those are some strategies. So understand there are some limits. This was not changed in the revised common rule. I'm going to talk about revised common rule a lot in exemptions because exemption is one area where they did make some pretty significant changes. The other one was prisoners. So you can't do exempt research involving prisoners, but they played with the language a little bit. So our rule we're under now says no go. But post they changed it, they gave a little exception. So you can't have exempt prisoners unless the research is involving a broader subject and, oh, by the way, there happen to be a few prisoners in the mix. So I'm not really targeting, my intent is not to study prisoners. It's just, I'm doing a group and the guy just happened to get a DOI or busted for marijuana, so now he's a prisoner. I didn't mean to collect his data. I'm not going after him because he's a prisoner, or she. Right? So they gave a little bit of flexibility, but just know, think about prisoners. And prisoners are not just the people in bars. It's anyone by court order who their freedom is restricted. So if you're a minor, a juvenile, and you're, as part of your court order, put into a home or a treatment center, that could be considered prisoners, depending on the situation, if you have an anklet monitor. So it's not just your typical go to prison, but if you're dealing with this, sit down, come have a chat. So big picture tips for submitting your IRB application. When it comes to exemptions, there's those special requirements. So we want to make sure that we have everything written down. There's a checklist that was given as part of your handouts. Make sure you go through those checklists. That's what we're doing. So no secrets. I'm giving you the same checklist that our members get, the same checklist I have in my house that I use to measure. So I've just given you the answers to the exam. Okay? No surprises. So take some time. I mean, this is complicated stuff. If you just tackle it all at once, take each piece individually and think through what you're doing, and you'll be totally fine. And like I said, come stop in. We can do it together. We'll fill out the forms together. But not having it written down, that's when things get long because we have to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. If you just write it down, get credit, then you'll just be fine. The other big picture of changes, so think about exempt categories and kind of why they did the change there, is they actually wanted to reduce the risk for research and employ more of a risk-based approach. So remember our triangle again, right? Where they can, and it's a minimal risk study, they want to move you up in the triangle. So the goal here was to allow more low-risk research to be eligible for exemption. So if you've submitted in the past and now you're submitting in our new rule, you might be eligible for exemption that you wouldn't before. Here's kind of the pre-rule and the post. So the exempt categories are simply the numbers based on the regs. So they did lots of jumbling, as you can say, from the slide.